The flames of the prairie fire had stolen everything from Pearl Foster when she was 7 years old, everything except her life and the copper-red hair that marked her as different in a world that valued conformity above all else. Now 21 years old in the spring of 1883, Pearl stood behind the counter of Henderson's General Store in Eagar, Arizona Territory, her hands mechanically folding bolts of calico, while Mrs. Catherine Miller and her daughter Ruth examined bonnets near the front window. Pearl knew what was coming before the words even left their mouths. She had heard variations of the same cruel observations for 14 years, ever since her Uncle Thomas had taken her in after her parents died and brought her to this unforgiving town. "That hair is positively unnatural, Mrs. Miller whispered to her daughter, though her voice carried clearly across the store's wooden floors. Like a warning sign from the devil himself. No wonder she remains unmarried at her age. Ruth giggled behind her gloved hand. "Mother, do you suppose it frightens away potential suitors?" "I heard James Whitmore say it reminded him of a barn catching fire." Pearl kept her eyes down, fingers pressing hard into the fabric until her knuckles turned white. The words stung less than they used to, but they still found their mark every single time. She had tried everything over the years, wearing bonnets that covered every strand, keeping her head bowed, making herself as invisible as possible. Nothing helped. In a town where most women had hair the color of wheat fields or dark earth, her vivid copper locks announced her presence before she entered a room. "Can I help you ladies find something?" Pearl finally asked, her voice steady despite the burning in her chest. Mrs. Miller turned with a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "We were just leaving, actually. Ruth needs a bonnet, but I think we will try the new milliner in Springerville. Better selection there." They swept out of the store in a rustle of petticoats, and Pearl released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in golden shafts of light. She returned to her folding, trying to lose herself in the mundane task. The bell above the door chimed again, and Pearl glanced up to see her employer, Mr. George Henderson, returning from the post office. He was a portly man in his 50s with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He had given Pearl this job 3 years ago when her uncle made it clear she needed to earn her keep or find somewhere else to live. "Afternoon, Miss Foster," he said warmly, setting a bundle of mail on the counter. "How has business been today?" "Slow, sir." Mrs. Miller and her daughter were in but did not purchase anything. Mr. Henderson's expression tightened slightly. He had overheard enough whispered comments to know what Pearl endured, though he never addressed it directly. "Well, the afternoon is young yet. I need to check on a shipment out back." "Mind the store for me." "Of course, sir." As he disappeared through the stockroom door, Pearl sorted through the mail, organizing it alphabetically for the various customers who would collect it throughout the week. She paused when she reached a letter addressed to her uncle, recognizing the script of his sister in Missouri. Her Aunt Clara wrote occasionally, usually with news of family back east or gentle inquiries about Pearl's well-being. Uncle Thomas never let Pearl read the letters, but sometimes she caught glimpses of the words before he snatched them away. The bell chimed again, and Pearl looked up expecting another customer. Instead, a tall man in dusty traveling clothes stepped inside, removing his wide-brimmed hat as he entered. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dust covered his boots and the lower half of his trousers, suggesting he had ridden some distance. Pearl had never seen him before, and she knew nearly everyone in Eagar and the surrounding ranches. "Welcome," she said, straightening behind the counter. "Can I help you find something?" The stranger moved deeper into the store, his gaze taking in the shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to farming implements. When his eyes finally settled on Pearl, something in his expression shifted. Not the usual recoil or poorly concealed distaste, but something else entirely. Something that made Pearl's cheeks warm under the intensity of his stare. "I am looking for supplies," he said, his voice deep and slightly rough, like gravel rolling in a stream. "I have taken work at the Double M Ranch north of here. Need basic provisions to get me through the first few weeks." "The Double M," Pearl repeated, grateful to have something concrete to focus on besides the way his gaze seemed to see right through her practiced invisibility. "That would be the morale spread. They run cattle up toward the White Mountains. That is the one." He set his hat on the counter and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Boss gave me a list." Pearl took the paper, her fingers briefly brushing his in the exchange. A jolt ran up her arm at the contact, surprising in its intensity. She unfolded the list and scanned the items, written in neat script. Coffee, beans, salt pork, flour, sugar, tobacco, soap, ammunition for a Winchester rifle. "I can gather all this for you," she said. "It will take just a few minutes. No hurry." The stranger leaned against the counter, watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Name is Isaiah Miller, by the way. Most folks call me Isaiah." Pearl retrieved a wooden crate from behind the counter and began collecting items from the shelves. "Miller. Any relation to the Miller family here in town?" "Not that I know of. Came down from Wyoming Territory. Figured Arizona might offer steadier work and warmer winters." "You figured right on the warmth," Pearl said, setting a 5-pound sack of flour in the crate. "Though the work can be hard, especially cattle ranching in this terrain. I am not afraid of hard work." There was a pause, and then he added, "You did not tell me your name." Pearl hesitated with her hand on a tin of coffee. Most people in town did not care to know her name beyond what was necessary for business. Pearl Foster." "Pearl," Isaiah repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Pretty name." She did not respond, focusing instead on measuring out the amount of tobacco from the jar. Compliments made her uncomfortable. They were so rare that she never knew how to receive them, always wondering if mockery hid beneath the pleasant words. "I notice you are not wearing a ring," Isaiah continued, his tone conversational but probing. "Seems strange in a small town like this. Would have expected a woman as striking as you to be spoken for." Pearl's hand stilled on the tobacco measure. "You have not been in town long enough to hear the local gossip, Mr. Miller. Call me Isaiah, please. And no, I rode straight here from the ranch." "Why? What would the gossip tell me?" She turned to face him, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. May as well get it over with now, before he heard it from someone else and came to his own conclusions. "It would tell you that my hair is a curse, that I am unmarriageable, that I am strange and possibly touched by evil forces. Take your pick of the various stories. They have had years to embellish the tales." Isaiah's expression did not change. He pushed away from the counter and moved closer, close enough that Pearl could smell leather and sage on his clothes. His eyes studied her face, then rose to her hair, which she had pinned up that morning in a practical bun at the base of her neck. Even contained as it was, strands had escaped throughout the day, catching the light from the window. "All I see is hair the color of copper pennies," he said quietly. "No, that is not quite right. It shines like the sunset I watched from the ridge this morning. All those colors mixed together, orange and red and gold. Most beautiful thing I saw today until I walked into this store." Pearl's breath caught in her throat. She searched his face for signs of cruelty, for the telltale curl of lips that preceded laughter at her expense. She found none. Isaiah's storm-gray eyes held nothing but sincerity and something warmer that made her pulse quicken. "You mock me, sir." But her voice wavered with uncertainty. "I do not mock, Miss Foster. I spent 3 years alone on the trail, working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas and back again. You learn to appreciate beauty when you see it, because there is precious little of it when you are eating dust and sleeping under the stars with nothing but ornery cows for company. Your hair is beautiful. Anyone who told you different is a fool." Pearl turned away quickly, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. She busied herself with finishing his order, stacking the last items into the crate with trembling hands. "That will be $4.60, Mr. Miller." Isaiah counted out the money from a worn leather wallet and placed it on the counter. He lifted the crate easily, settling it against his hip. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "I meant what I said, Miss Foster, about your hair and about everything else." Then he was gone, the bell chiming in his wake, leaving Pearl standing alone in the quiet store with her heart beating a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. Mr. Henderson emerged from the stockroom a few minutes later. "Was that someone from the Double M?" "Yes, sir. New hand." "Isaiah Miller." "Good outfit. The Double M. Miguel Morales runs an honest operation." He studied Pearl's flushed face. "You all right, Miss Foster? You look a bit feverish." "I am fine, sir. Just warm in here with the afternoon sun," but she was not fine. Pearl had learned long ago to protect herself from Hope, from the dangerous belief that anyone might see her as something other than the girl with the cursed red hair. Hope led only to disappointment and deeper pain. Yet Isaiah Miller's words echoed in her mind throughout the rest of the afternoon, stubborn and persistent as a melody she could not shake. That evening, Pearl walked the half-mile to her uncle's house on the edge of town. The small adobe structure sat on a dusty lot, surrounded by struggling vegetable patches that Pearl tended in her spare time. Uncle Thomas was already home, sitting on the porch in his rocking chair, pipe smoke curling into the evening air. He was a lean man with a weathered face and hands permanently stained from his work as a tanner. "About time you got home," he called as she approached. "Supper should have been started an hour ago." "I apologize, Uncle. Mr. Henderson needed help with inventory after closing." Thomas grunted, his eyes following her as she climbed the porch steps. "Mrs. Miller stopped by this afternoon. Said you were rude to her and Ruth at the store." Pearl's stomach sank. "I was not rude, Uncle. I offered to help them find what they needed." "She said you gave her an unpleasant look. Made her uncomfortable." He pointed at her with his pipe stem. "You need to be more careful, girl. This town has been good enough to tolerate your presence, but that can change. We are not back in Kansas anymore where your mother's strange blood could hide among strangers. Here, everyone knows everyone, and you need to fit in." Pearl swallowed her response. She had heard this lecture countless times. Her mother had come from a family of Irish immigrants, and her red hair was a trait that ran strong in that bloodline. Uncle Thomas had never forgiven his brother for marrying outside what he considered proper society. "I will try to be better, Uncle. See that you do. Now get inside and fix something to eat. I am hungry enough to eat leather." Pearl escaped into the house, grateful for the reprieve. The interior was sparse but clean, with a cooking stove that she had learned to manage over the years, and a small table with 2 chairs. Her own sleeping space was a narrow room barely large enough for a cot, and a small chest that held her few possessions. As she prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, her mind kept drifting back to Isaiah Miller. She tried to push the thoughts away, to remind herself that pretty words meant nothing. But she could still see the way he had looked at her, could still hear the rough sincerity in his voice when he compared her hair to a sunset. Over the next few weeks, Pearl found herself watching the door of the general store more than she cared to admit. Each time the bell chimed, her heart would leap, only to settle back into disappointed rhythm when someone else entered. Isaiah did not return, and Pearl told herself it was better that way. He had been passing through her life like a sudden summer storm, brief and intense, and ultimately fleeting. Then, on a Saturday morning in early June when the heat already shimmered off the dirt streets, the bell chimed and Isaiah Miller walked back into the store. He looked much the same as before, though perhaps the sun had darkened his skin a shade, and his clothes were different, cleaner. His gray eyes found her immediately, and a smile touched his lips. "Morning, Miss Foster." Pearl's hands tightened on the broom she had been using to sweep the floor. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. What can I help you with today?" "Isaiah," he corrected gently, moving to the counter. "I need another supply run, but truth be told, I could have waited a few more days. I wanted to see if you might walk with me after you finish work today. Thought I could show you the sunset from that ridge I mentioned, the one that reminded me of your hair." Pearl's first instinct was to refuse. Going anywhere with a man unchaperoned would set the town tongues wagging worse than they already did. But something in her rebelled at the constant weight of others' opinions. What did she have to lose? They already thought the worst of her. "I finish at 6 o'clock, she heard herself say. "But I cannot be gone long. My uncle expects me home for supper." Isaiah's smile widened. "6 o'clock is perfect. I will have my horse ready." The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. Pearl moved through her duties mechanically, her mind racing with equal parts excitement and anxiety. She caught Mr. Henderson watching her with knowing eyes once or twice, but he said nothing. At 10 minutes to 6, she retreated to the back room and did something she had not done in years. She unpinned her hair and let it fall in waves down her back, before combing it carefully and re-pinning it in a softer style that allowed some of the strands to frame her face. When she emerged, Mr. Henderson was totaling the day's receipts. He glanced up and his eyebrows rose slightly, but he just said, "Have a pleasant evening, Miss Foster. You have earned some time for yourself." Isaiah was waiting outside with a handsome bay gelding. He had brushed the dust from his clothes and looked almost nervous, a trait that Pearl found endearing. "You look lovely," he said simply. Pearl did not know how to respond, so she just nodded. Isaiah helped her mount the horse, then swung up behind her. They rode out of town at a steady pace, and Pearl was acutely aware of the stares following them, the faces appearing in windows. Let them stare. For once, she did not care. The ridge was a 20-minute ride north, rising gradually from the flat land surrounding Eager. The white mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the advancing summer. Isaiah guided the horse to a flat outcropping of rock that overlooked miles of open territory, painted in the warm gold of approaching sunset. He dismounted first, then helped Pearl down. His hands lingered at her waist just a moment longer than necessary, and she felt the warmth of them through the fabric of her dress. "This is beautiful," Pearl said, turning to take in the view. "Wait until the sun really starts to set. That is when the magic happens." They stood in companionable silence as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Isaiah had been right. As the light changed, the sky erupted in colors that defied description. Oranges and reds and purples layered across the clouds, reflecting off the scattered rock formations and turning the whole world into something out of a dream. "See," Isaiah said softly, standing close beside her. "That is what I see when I look at your hair. All those colors dancing together, too beautiful to be just one simple shade." Pearl turned to look at him and found him already watching her instead of the sunset. "Why?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks finally emerging. Why are you kind to me when everyone else in this town has decided I am not worth their kindness? Isaiah reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, his fingers brushed a strand of copper hair that had escaped her pins. I grew up in a mining town in Montana Territory. My mother died when I was 6, and my father worked himself to death in the mines by the time I was 12. After that, I was on my own. I learned early that the world is full of people who will judge you for things you cannot control. Where you come from, who your parents were, what you look like. But I also learned that the measure of a person has nothing to do with any of that. It is about who you are inside, how you treat others when no one is watching, whether you maintain your dignity in the face of cruelty. He tucked the strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. From what I have seen and heard, Miss Foster, you have more dignity and grace than everyone in this town combined. You keep your head high even when they try to grind you down. That takes real strength. That is what I see when I look at you. And yes, I see beauty too, because you are beautiful inside and out. Tears spilled down Pearl's cheeks before she could stop them. You do not know me. You do not know the things they say. Then tell me everything. Let me know you. So she did. Standing on that ridge with the sunset painting the world in fire, Pearl told Isaiah Miller everything. About her parents and the fire that killed them. About the years of mockery and isolation. About her uncle's barely concealed resentment, and the way the town had collectively decided she was less than human because of the color of her hair. About the loneliness that sometimes felt like it would swallow her whole. Isaiah listened without interruption, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When she finally fell silent, hoarse from talking, he did something that surprised her. He took both her hands in his and said, "Thank you for trusting me with all of that. I know it was not easy." "I do not understand why you care," Pearl whispered. "Because in the 3 years I spent alone, I promised myself that if I ever found someone worth caring about, I would not let her slip away because I was too scared or too proud to say how I felt. And Pearl, I think you might be worth caring about very much." He pulled her closer, slowly enough that she could refuse if she wanted. But Pearl did not want to refuse. She let him draw her into his arms, let herself rest her head against his chest and hear the steady beat of his heart. She could not remember the last time anyone had held her like this, as if she were something precious. They stayed on the ridge until the last light faded from the sky and stars began to emerge like scattered diamonds. Isaiah rode her back to the edge of town, stopping far enough from her uncle's house to avoid immediate notice. "Can I see you again?" he asked as he helped her dismount. Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Isaiah smiled, touched her cheek once more and rode off into the darkness. Pearl floated home, her feet barely touching the ground. Uncle Thomas was waiting on the porch, his expression thunderous. "Where have you been? And do not lie to me, girl. Half the town saw you ride off with that cowboy from the Double M. I went to watch the sunset. We were not gone long." Thomas stood, his face flushing with anger. "You went unchaperoned with a man you barely know. Do you have any idea what this will do to your reputation? To my reputation?" "I have no reputation to damage, Uncle. The town decided long ago what they think of me." "That is no excuse for improper behavior." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "You are living under my roof, eating my food. You will conduct yourself appropriately, or you will find yourself on the street. You understand me?" Pearl met his eyes steadily. "I understand you, Uncle." "Good. Now get inside and stay there. You are not to see that man again." But Pearl had no intention of obeying. For the first time in her life, someone saw her as more than the strange girl with red hair. Someone thought she was worth knowing, worth caring about. She was not about to give that up because of her uncle's anger or the town's disapproval. Over the next month, Pearl and Isaiah found ways to see each other. He would come to the store on his days off, lingering over supply lists and conversations that stretched far longer than necessary. Mr. Henderson noticed but said nothing, though Pearl caught him smiling to himself more than once. On Sundays, when the store was closed and her uncle went to the saloon to drink away his weekly wages, Isaiah would meet her at a spot beyond the edge of town, where a small creek wound through cottonwood trees. They would sit on the bank and talk for hours. Isaiah told her about his lonely childhood, about the years drifting from job to job, searching for a place that felt like home. Pearl shared her dreams, things she had never dared speak aloud before. She wanted to see the ocean someday. She wanted to learn to read better, to own books of her own. She wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere with someone. "You belong with me," Isaiah said one Sunday in July, the heat of the day pressing down around them. "If you will have me, that is." Pearl's heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" Isaiah took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you, Pearl Foster. I love your strength and your kindness, and yes, I love your beautiful red hair. I love the way you bite your lip when you are thinking hard about something. I love how you always try to see the good in people, even when they have given you no reason to. I love everything about you, and I want to build a life with you if you will let me." Pearl stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. Love. He loved her. This strong, kind man who could have chosen anyone actually loved her. "I have nothing to bring to a marriage," she finally said. "No dowry, no family support. My uncle would probably dance at the news that I was leaving. I do not want your dowry or your uncle's blessing. I want you, just you. The town will talk. They will say terrible things about you for marrying me." Isaiah cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes intense. "Let them talk. Their opinions mean nothing to me. You are the only one whose opinion matters. So I am asking you straight, Pearl, will you marry me?" Pearl felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but these were different from all the tears she had cried over the years. These were tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so sharp it almost hurt. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Isaiah kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Pearl felt something inside her that had been locked tight for years finally break free. She was loved. She was wanted. She was enough. They made plans quickly. Isaiah spoke to Miguel Morales, the owner of the Double M, who agreed to let them use a small cabin on the ranch property. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a lean-to for cooking, but it would be theirs. Pearl gave her notice to Mr. Henderson, who congratulated her warmly and pressed an envelope into her hands that contained a generous final payment and a little extra. She told her uncle that evening after he came home from the saloon, slightly unsteady on his feet. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then spat in the dirt. "Fine. Good riddance. You have been nothing but a burden since your father dumped you on me." The words should have hurt, but Pearl found they bounced off her like stones off armor. She had Isaiah now, and his love was a shield against the cruelty of small minds. They married in the church in Eager on the first Sunday in August, 1883. Pearl wore a simple dress that she had carefully sewn herself from fabric Mr. Henderson had given her at a discount. She left her hair down, flowing in copper waves across her shoulders because Isaiah had asked her to. The church was nearly empty. Uncle Thomas did not attend, but Mr. Henderson was there, and Miguel Morales and his wife, and a few of the hands from the Double M. The preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Charles Walsh, married them in a ceremony that was brief but heartfelt. When Isaiah kissed her at the end, sealing their vows, Pearl heard someone in the back pew whisper about the scandal of it all. She did not care. She was Mrs. Isaiah Miller now, and that was all that mattered. They moved into the cabin that afternoon. It was small and spare, but Pearl had never been happier. Over the next few weeks, she made it into a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and planted a small garden in the yard. Isaiah built her shelves for the few books she had managed to acquire over the years. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, and Isaiah would tell her that she was still the most beautiful sunset he had ever seen. Life on the ranch was hard work, but it was good work. Pearl helped where she could, learning to tend chickens and make cheese and all the other skills that ranch life required. The other hands were polite to her, and some of the wives reached out with cautious friendship. Word traveled slowly in the territory, but eventually, people heard that Pearl Foster had married one of the hands from the Double M. The reactions in town were mixed. Some, like Mrs. Miller, made it clear they thought Isaiah had made a terrible mistake. Others, particularly some of the younger women who had always secretly envied Pearl's striking looks despite the mockery, seemed almost disappointed that she had found happiness. But a few, like Mr. Henderson and old Mrs. Josephine Fuller, who ran the boarding house, expressed genuine happiness for the couple. Pearl and Isaiah settled into the rhythms of married life. They learned each other's habits and quirks. Pearl discovered that Isaiah snored softly when he slept on his back, and that he was hopeless at cooking anything more complicated than beans. Isaiah learned that Pearl had a beautiful singing voice that she only used when she thought no one was listening, and that she was afraid of thunder because it reminded her of the night her parents died. They learned to navigate disagreements, like when Isaiah wanted to spend money on a new saddle and Pearl argued they should save it for winter supplies. They learned to support each other through difficulties, like when a summer drought threatened the ranch's water supply and everyone had to work double shifts to keep the cattle alive. And they learned, gradually and beautifully, what it meant to truly love someone. Not the rushed passion of new attraction, but the deeper, steadier love that comes from choosing someone every day, from seeing them at their worst and loving them anyway, from building a life together piece by careful piece. That winter, Pearl discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had no mother to guide her through this, no female relatives to offer advice. But Isaiah's support never wavered. He was at her side through every stage of the pregnancy, holding her hair when morning sickness struck, rubbing her aching feet in the evenings, talking softly to her swollen belly about all the things he would teach their child. Miguel's wife, Rosa, took Pearl under her wing. She was a kind woman in her 40s who had raised 5 children of her own. She taught Pearl what to expect, helped her prepare baby clothes and blankets, and promised to be there when the time came. Pearl went into labor on a cold night in March of 1884. Isaiah rode through a late spring storm to fetch Rosa, then stayed by Pearl's side through the long hours that followed. He held her hand and wiped her forehead and told her how strong she was, how proud he was of her. Their son was born just as dawn broke, his first cries announcing his arrival to the world. Isaiah wept when he held the baby for the first time, this tiny person with a shock of dark hair and gray eyes that already seemed to be studying everything around him. "What should we name him?" Pearl asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Isaiah looked down at his son, then at his wife. "Thomas," he said. "After your father, not your uncle. I want him to carry the name of a man who loved you the way you deserve to be loved." Fresh tears slipped down Pearl's cheeks. "Thomas Isaiah Miller," she said. "It is perfect." The years that followed were not always easy, but they were rich with love and purpose. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's copper hair. When Pearl saw that telltale red in his baby curls, she had a moment of fear. What if he was mocked the way she had been? What if her curse had passed to him? But Isaiah put those fears to rest. "He will be strong like his mother," he said firmly. "And we will teach him that his hair is something to be proud of, not ashamed of. Times are changing, Pearl. The world is getting bigger. Someday, no one will think twice about the color of someone's hair." Pearl wanted to believe him, and in small ways she saw evidence that he was right. A new family moved to Eager in 1885, and the mother had hair nearly as red as Pearl's. Some of the old attitudes began to soften, though there were always those like Mrs. Miller who clung to their prejudices. Pearl did not let it bother her anymore. She had built a life that was bigger than the narrow opinions of small-minded people. She had a husband who loved her fiercely and completely. She had a son who filled their home with laughter. She had friends, real friends, who valued her for who she was. In 1887, Pearl gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose. She had Isaiah's dark hair and Pearl's green eyes, and from the moment she arrived, she wrapped her father around her tiny finger. Thomas, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and appointed himself her protector. The cabin grew crowded with 2 children, so Isaiah and Miguel worked together to add another room. Pearl planted more vegetables in the garden and learned to stretch every penny. Money was always tight, but they never went without the important things. There was always food on the table and wood for the fire and love in abundance. On their 5th anniversary, Isaiah surprised Pearl with a gift. He had saved money for months, skimping on his own needs to afford it. When Pearl unwrapped the package, she found a beautiful tortoiseshell comb decorated with small copper beads that caught the light. "For your beautiful hair," Isaiah said, "so you can wear it up fancy when you want to feel special." Pearl threw her arms around him, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "You make me feel special every single day," she whispered against his neck. "Good. That is exactly what I intend to do for the rest of our lives." In 1889, Miguel Morales made Isaiah an offer. He was getting older and wanted to step back from the day-to-day running of the ranch. He had watched Isaiah work for 6 years now and trusted his judgment and dedication. He offered to make Isaiah his foreman, with a significant increase in pay and greater responsibility. Isaiah accepted immediately, but only after confirming with Pearl that she was comfortable with the additional demands on his time. Pearl assured him that she was proud of him and that they would make it work. The promotion meant they could afford a larger house. Miguel helped them build a proper home on ranch land, with 3 bedrooms and a real kitchen and a parlor where Pearl could receive guests. It was the finest place Pearl had ever lived, and sometimes she had to pinch herself to believe it was real. As foreman, Isaiah earned respect from the other ranch hands and from the broader community. Even some of the people in Eager who had turned up their noses at Pearl began to treat her with a certain grudging respect. She was no longer just the strange girl with red hair. She was Mrs. Miller, wife of the foreman of one of the most successful ranches in the territory. But the real change in how people treated her came from Pearl herself. She had learned, through Isaiah's love and her own growing confidence, that she did not need their approval. She was polite but no longer deferential to people who had been cruel to her. She held her head high when she walked through town, meeting curious stares with calm dignity. And slowly, people began to see her differently, not as a curiosity or an object of mockery, but as a person worthy of respect. In 1891, Pearl gave birth to another son, whom they named Henry Joseph. He had Pearl's red hair from birth, even brighter than Thomas's had been. When Mrs. Miller encountered Pearl in town a few months later and made a snide comment about more of that cursed hair, Pearl simply smiled. "I find it beautiful," she said calmly, "just like my husband does. Good day, Mrs. Miller." She walked away without waiting for a response, pushing Henry's pram with her head held high. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Miller sputter with indignation, and she found she could not bring herself to care. That evening she told Isaiah about the encounter. He pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "That is my Pearl," he said proudly. "The strongest woman I know." The children grew and the ranch prospered. In 1893, Arizona Territory was booming, with new families arriving regularly as the railroad expanded access to the region. Eager grew from a small outpost into a proper town, with new businesses and even a real school. Pearl enrolled Thomas, now 9 years old, in the school. She worried about how the other children would treat him because of his red hair, but her fears proved largely unfounded. Thomas was confident and friendly, traits he had learned from his father, and he made friends easily. When one boy tried to tease him about his hair, Thomas simply said, "My ma has red hair too, and she is the prettiest and smartest woman in the territory, so I figure having red hair just means I might turn out half as good as her." The other boy had no response to that, and the teasing stopped. Pearl heard about the incident from Thomas's teacher, a young woman named Miss Elizabeth Grant, who had come west from Boston. She sought Pearl out one afternoon at the general store, where Pearl still shopped regularly despite some of the old tensions. "Mrs. Miller, I wanted you to know that your son is a credit to you and your husband," Miss Grant said warmly. "He is bright and kind and defends the other children when they are being picked on. You should be very proud." Pearl's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Miss Grant. That means more than you know." "I can imagine it has not always been easy for you here," Miss Grant said carefully. "Small towns can be quite unforgiving of anyone who is different, but you have raised a remarkable boy. I hope you know that." Pearl did know, and the knowledge filled her with gratitude. Her children were growing up with a security and confidence she had never known at their age. They knew they were loved. They knew their appearance was nothing to be ashamed of. And they were learning to treat others with the same kindness and respect their parents showed them. In 1895, Pearl's uncle Thomas died from liver failure, the result of years of heavy drinking. Pearl learned about his death from the pastor, who came to the ranch to inform her. She felt no grief, only a kind of sad relief that a painful chapter of her life was truly closed. She attended the funeral because it was proper, but she did not mourn him. Isaiah stood beside her, his steady presence a reminder of how far she had come from the frightened girl who had cowered under her uncle's criticism. After the service, several people approached Pearl to express condolences. Some of them were the same people who had mocked her years ago, and Pearl could see the discomfort in their faces as they struggled with how to interact with her now that she was no longer powerless. She was gracious but distant, accepting their words without offering anything in return. She had learned that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and she was under no obligation to make these people comfortable. That night, lying in bed with Isaiah, she said, "Is it wrong that I feel nothing about my uncle's passing?" Isaiah pulled her closer. "He was not kind to you, Pearl. You do not owe him grief. All you owe is kindness to the people who deserve it and boundaries with those who do not." "How did you get so wise?" she asked with a small smile. "Married a smart woman. Some of it must have rubbed off on me." The late 1890s brought continued growth and change to the territory. In 1896, the railroad reached Eager, transforming the town and opening up new opportunities for commerce. Miguel Morales expanded the ranch, buying additional land and increasing the cattle herds. Isaiah's responsibilities grew accordingly, and so did his reputation. He was known throughout the territory as a fair, honest man who ran a tight ship, but treated his workers well. Pearl found her own ways to contribute to the community. She started teaching some of the ranch women to read and write, skills she had painstakingly taught herself over the years with Isaiah's help. The informal classes grew, and eventually she was teaching children as well, holding lessons in her parlor for families too far from town to easily attend the school. In 1898, war broke out between the United States and Spain. It was a distant conflict that had little direct impact on daily life in Arizona, but several young men from the area enlisted. Isaiah was too old for the draft at 36, and his responsibilities to the ranch kept him home. But they prayed for the young soldiers and contributed what they could to relief efforts. That same year, Sarah started school alongside her older brother. She was bright and curious, with none of the self-consciousness that had plagued Pearl at her age. Pearl watched her daughter walk confidently into the schoolhouse on her first day and felt her heart swell with pride and gratitude. Young Henry, now 7, was proving to be the most headstrong of the children. His bright red hair was matched by an equally fiery temperament, and he got into his share of scrapes with the other ranch children. But he had a good heart, always quick to apologize and make amends when he knew he had done wrong. In 1900, as the new century dawned, the Miller family celebrated at a church social and eager. The whole town turned out, and there was music and dancing and food in abundance. Pearl wore her best dress, the dark blue one with lace at the collar, and the tortoiseshell comb Isaiah had given her years ago. Her hair, now lightly threaded with silver at the temples, was pinned up in an elegant style that showed off the comb. She was standing with Rosa Morales, watching the children play when Mrs. Miller approached. The older woman looked frail now, her spine curved with age and her face deeply lined. "Mrs. Miller," Pearl said politely, nodding her head. "Mrs. Miller," Catherine replied, and there was something different in her tone, something almost apologetic. "I wanted to say that your children are a credit to you. Your sons are fine boys and your daughter is quite accomplished for her age." Pearl studied the older woman, trying to determine if this was some new form of mockery, but Mrs. Miller's eyes held only sincerity and perhaps a touch of regret. "Thank you," Pearl said carefully. "That is kind of you to say." Mrs. Miller fidgeted with her reticule. "I have not always been kind to you. I want you to know that I regret that now. My Ruth never married, you see. She is 40 now and bitter about it, though she will not admit it. But you married well and built a good life for yourself despite everything. I should have congratulated you instead of criticizing you. I see that now." Pearl felt a complicated swirl of emotions, anger at the years of cruelty, satisfaction at this admission, and ultimately a kind of pity for this old woman who was facing the end of her life with regrets. "I appreciate you saying so, Mrs. Miller," Pearl said finally. "It takes courage to admit when we have been wrong." The older woman nodded, then moved away, disappearing into the crowd. Isaiah appeared at Pearl's side a moment later, sliding his arm around her waist. "What was that about?" he asked. Pearl leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and sage that always clung to his clothes. "Closure," she said. "I think that was about closure." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Pearl found herself reflecting on the strange journey her life had taken. From that frightened, mocked girl standing behind the counter of Henderson's general store, to this woman surrounded by family and friends, respected in her community, secure in the love of a good man. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Isaiah led Pearl onto the makeshift dance floor that had been set up in the churchyard. They moved together with the ease of long practice, having danced together countless times over the years. "You know what I was thinking about earlier?" Isaiah asked as they swayed to the music. "Tell me." "That day I walked into Henderson's store nearly 17 years ago now. I almost did not stop in Eager at all. I was planning to ride straight through to the ranch, but my horse threw a shoe and I had to stop to get it fixed. If that had not happened, I might never have met you." Pearl looked up at him, this man who had changed everything for her. "I cannot imagine my life without you, and I cannot imagine mine without you. You are still the most beautiful sunset I have ever seen, Pearl Miller. Every single day with you is a gift." They kissed right there on the dance floor, uncaring of who saw or what anyone thought. Around them, the century turned and the world continued its inexorable march toward the future. But in that moment, Pearl and Isaiah existed in a perfect bubble of happiness. The early years of the 20th century brought more changes to the Arizona Territory. In 1902, the government passed new laws governing land rights and water access, which created some challenges for the ranchers. Miguel was getting older and relied more heavily on Isaiah to navigate the complex regulations. Isaiah proved himself more than capable, protecting the double MTK's interests while maintaining good relationships with neighboring ranches and local officials. Pearl watched her children grow with pride. Thomas, now 18, was showing real aptitude for ranch management. He worked alongside his father, learning every aspect of the operation. He was courting a girl from town, a sweet-natured young woman named Lucy Thompson who worked at the new library. Sarah, at 15, was already talking about becoming a teacher. She spent hours helping Pearl with the informal lessons they held at the house, and showed real skill at explaining difficult concepts to younger children. She had applied to a teacher's college in New Mexico Territory and was anxiously awaiting their response. Henry, at 11, remained the wildest of the three children. He was happiest on horseback, racing across the open range with an abandon that made Pearl's heart leap into her throat. But he was also fiercely protective of his family, and had gotten into more than one fight defending his siblings or mother from perceived slights. In the spring of 1903, Sarah received her acceptance letter from the teacher's college. The whole family celebrated, though Pearl's joy was tinged with sadness at the thought of her daughter leaving home. But she knew it was necessary. Sarah had dreams of her own to pursue, just as Pearl had once dreamed of a life beyond mockery and isolation. That summer, Thomas announced his engagement to Lucy. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and Pearl threw herself into preparations. She sewed Lucy's wedding dress herself, carefully stitching tiny beads onto the bodice that caught the light like dewdrops. It was a gift of love for her future daughter-in-law, and Lucy wept when she saw the finished product. The wedding took place on a warm April day in 1904. Thomas looked so much like Isaiah had at that age that Pearl felt her breath catch when she saw him waiting at the altar. Lucy was radiant in the dress Pearl had made, and their vows were heartfelt and sincere. Watching her son marry for love, Pearl felt the circle of her own life coming around in the most beautiful way. Thomas and Lucy moved into a small house on ranch property, not far from where Pearl and Isaiah had started their own married life. Pearl remembered those early days so clearly, the joy of building something from nothing, the wonder of being loved and wanted. She hoped Thomas and Lucy would find the same happiness. Sarah left for college that fall, and the house felt empty without her bright presence. But she wrote letters every week, full of details about her classes and new friends and all the exciting things she was learning. Pearl saved every letter, tucking them into a wooden box that she kept on her dresser. In 1905, Henry started high school in Eager. He continued to struggle with his temper, particularly when anyone made comments about his red hair. Pearl and Isaiah worked with him constantly, trying to teach him that the opinions of ignorant people did not matter, that true strength came from controlling oneself rather than lashing out. "I just want them to stop," Henry said one evening after getting into a fight with another boy at school. "Why do they care so much about my hair?" Pearl sat beside him on the porch steps, this boy who reminded her so much of herself at that age. "Because people fear what is different," she said gently. "And fear often turns into cruelty. But Henry, you have something I did not have when I was your age. You have a family who loves you, who reminds you every day that you are valuable and worthy. You have seen how your father and I built a good life, despite what people said. You know it is possible to rise above the small-mindedness of others." "It still hurts," Henry admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I know, sweetheart, I know." Pearl put her arm around him, pulling him close. "But pain does not have to define you. You get to choose who you become. And I believe you will choose to be like your father, strong and kind and unshakable in your sense of what is right." Henry leaned into her embrace, and Pearl felt his shoulders relax. They sat together in the gathering dusk, mother and son, while the sky turned those familiar shades of orange and red and gold that had once reminded a lonely cowboy of a woman he had not yet met. In 1906, Miguel Morales made another significant announcement. He was retiring completely and selling the Double M to Isaiah. It was an opportunity Isaiah had never dared dream of, but Miguel insisted. Isaiah had been the heart of the ranch's success for years now, and Miguel wanted to see it in his hands. The sale price was fair but substantial. Isaiah and Pearl had saved money over the years, and Miguel agreed to favorable terms for the remainder. After much discussion and some anxious nights lying awake going over figures, they accepted the offer. Pearl Foster Miller, the girl who had once been mocked and dismissed as unmarriageable, was now the co-owner of one of the most successful cattle ranches in the Arizona Territory. The irony was not lost on her. One afternoon, she encountered Ruth Miller in town. Ruth was nearly 50 now, living alone in her mother's old house and supporting herself by taking in sewing. The bitterness that her mother had mentioned years ago was evident in every line of her face. "Mrs. Miller," Ruth said stiffly when they crossed paths outside the dry goods store. "Miss Miller," Pearl replied pleasantly. "I hope you are well." "I manage," Ruth said. "I hear you bought the Double M. How fortunate for you." Pearl heard the envy beneath the words but refused to engage with it. "We have been very blessed," she agreed. "My husband has worked hard for many years, and it is gratifying to see that work rewarded." Ruth opened her mouth as if to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. She nodded curtly and walked away, her back rigid with unspoken resentment. Pearl watched her go and felt not triumph, but sadness. Ruth had wasted her life nursing prejudices and judgments, and now she was alone and bitter. It could have been Pearl's fate too if not for Isaiah. That night, Pearl told Isaiah about the encounter. They were lying in bed, the window open to let in the cool evening breeze. "You ever feel like you want revenge against the people who were cruel to you?" Isaiah asked. Pearl thought about it. "I used to," she admitted. "When I was younger, I used to fantasize about becoming successful and beautiful and making them all regret how they treated me. But now, I just feel sorry for them. They missed the opportunity to know me, to see me as a person instead of just red hair and strange blood. That is their loss, not mine. I got you and our children and this wonderful life. What more revenge could I possibly need?" Isaiah pulled her closer. "You are an amazing woman, Pearl Miller. I fall more in love with you every single day, even though my hair has silver in it now," she teased, "especially because of that. It means we have lived a life together. It means we have years of memories and experiences and love woven into every strand. Your hair is still beautiful to me, Pearl. It always will be." In 1907, Sarah graduated from Teachers College and returned to eager to teach at the elementary school. She moved back into the family home temporarily while she looked for her own place, and the house felt complete again with all 3 children under the roof, even if only briefly. Thomas and Lucy announced they were expecting their first child, making Pearl and Isaiah grandparents for the first time. The news filled Pearl with joy and also a sense of wonder at how time had passed. It seemed like only yesterday she was holding baby Thomas in her arms, and now he was about to become a father himself. The baby, a girl they named Catherine Pearl after both her grandmothers, was born in January 1908. Pearl wept when Thomas handed her the tiny bundle, this next generation carrying forward the legacy of love and resilience that she and Isaiah had built. Little Katie had wispy dark hair and her grandfather's gray eyes. As she grew, though, it became clear that she had inherited the red hair that ran in the family. Pearl watched Thomas and Lucy handle it with grace, teaching their daughter from the beginning that her hair was beautiful and special. The attitudes in the territory had shifted enough by then that the mockery Pearl had endured was less common, though it still existed in pockets. Henry graduated from high school in 1909 and announced his intention to join the cavalry. It was peacetime, and he wanted to see more of the country, to have adventures before settling down to ranching life. Pearl's heart ached at the thought of him leaving, but she understood. He needed to find his own path, just as she and Isaiah had. They saw Henry off at the train station in September. The whole family gathered to say goodbye. Henry looked so young and eager in his new uniform, his red hair blazing bright under the Arizona sun. "Take care of yourself," Pearl said, hugging him tightly. "Write to us." "I will, Ma, I promise." Henry pulled back and looked at both his parents seriously. "Thank you for teaching me to be strong, for showing me that what other people think does not define who I am. I am going to make you proud." "You already have," Isaiah said, his voice rough with emotion. They watched the train pull away, carrying their youngest child toward an uncertain future. Pearl leaned into Isaiah, grateful for his solid presence beside her. Sarah married in 1910 to a fellow teacher named Robert James Fairchild. He was a good man who clearly adored her, and Pearl approved wholeheartedly. The wedding was smaller than Thomas's had been, but no less joyful. Sarah wore Pearl's own wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, and Pearl felt the symbolism of it deep in her bones. Her daughter was stepping into her own happily ever after, and Pearl could not have been more grateful. In 1911, Pearl turned 49 years old. Her hair was now more silver than red, and lines marked the corners of her eyes and mouth. But she felt more beautiful than she ever had in her youth. She was confident and secure, surrounded by love, respected in her community. One evening, she and Isaiah sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done thousands of times over the years. The sky was particularly spectacular that night, streaked with brilliant shades of crimson and orange. "Still reminds me of you," Isaiah said, reaching over to take her hand. "That first day I saw you in Henderson's store, you looked so sad, like you were trying to make yourself invisible. All I could think was that someone as beautiful as you should never have to hide." Pearl squeezed his hand. "You saved me, you know. I was drowning in that town in all the cruelty and judgment. You threw me a lifeline." "We saved each other," Isaiah corrected. "I was just as lonely as you were, Pearl." I spent years drifting, never putting down roots because I did not think I deserved a home, but you gave me one. You gave me purpose and love and a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors fade from the sky. Pearl thought about all the years that had passed since that first meeting, all the challenges they had overcome, all the joy they had shared. It had not always been easy, but it had always been worth it. In 1912, Arizona finally achieved statehood, becoming the 48th state admitted to the Union. The whole territory celebrated, and Pearl felt a special pride in being part of this place that had eventually become home. It had taken time and struggle, but she had earned her place here. Thomas took over more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, allowing Isaiah to step back slightly. At 50, Isaiah was still strong and capable, but the years of hard work had taken their toll. Pearl noticed him moving more slowly in the mornings, saw the way he sometimes rubbed his lower back after a long day. She worried about him but knew better than to fuss. Isaiah was proud, and he would work until he could not anymore. Henry came home from the cavalry in 1913, having completed his term of service. He was 22 now, more mature and settled. The army had been good for him, giving him discipline and purpose and helping him channel his fierce energy in productive directions. He announced his intention to stay in Arizona and work on the family ranch, which delighted both Pearl and Isaiah. Sarah and Robert had their first child in 1914, a son they named Marcus. Pearl found herself a grandmother twice over now, and she loved watching her grandchildren grow. Katie was 6 and full of questions about everything. Marcus was a calm baby who rarely fussed, content to observe the world with solemn dark eyes. The summer of 1914 also brought news of war in Europe. It seemed impossibly far away from the Arizona ranch land, but Pearl followed the newspaper reports with growing concern. She remembered the Spanish-American War and prayed this conflict would remain distant and not pull America into its destructive path. In 1915, Thomas and Lucy had their second child, a boy they named Isaiah Thomas Miller. Pearl watched her husband hold his tiny namesake and saw tears in his eyes. These were the moments that made all the years of struggle worthwhile, Pearl thought. This legacy of love passing from generation to generation. In early 1917, Pearl noticed Isaiah becoming increasingly tired. He dismissed her concerns, insisting he was just getting older and needed more rest. But Pearl pushed until he agreed to see the doctor in town. The diagnosis was heart trouble. The doctor prescribed rest and light activity, which Isaiah followed grudgingly. Pearl watched him like a hawk, making sure he did not overexert himself. Thomas took over complete control of the ranch operations, and Henry became his right hand, learning everything he needed to know to eventually take his own role in the family business. That April, America entered the Great War. Henry, with his cavalry experience, was called back into service. Pearl's heart broke at the thought of him going overseas to fight, but she was also proud of his willingness to serve. They had a family dinner before he left, all of them gathered around the big table in the dining room. Pearl looked at each beloved face and committed the moment to memory, praying it would not be the last time they were all together. Isaiah recovered enough to return to light work, though he would never again have the stamina he once possessed. Pearl adjusted to this new reality, grateful for every day they had together. They were approaching their 35th wedding anniversary, 3.5 decades of love and partnership and shared dreams. On a warm evening in July 1918, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of each day. Isaiah had his arm around Pearl and she leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side as she always had. "You remember that first sunset I showed you?" Isaiah asked. "Up on the ridge." "I remember everything about that day," Pearl said. "I was so afraid to hope that you were sincere, that someone could really see me as something other than the cursed red-haired girl. I saw you exactly as you were, beautiful and strong and kind. I still see you that way, Pearl. Every single day." Pearl turned to look at him, this man who had given her everything. His face was lined now, his hair completely gray, but his eyes were the same storm gray that had captured her attention 35 years ago. "I love you," she said simply. "More than I can ever express in words. You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible. I love you too. And Pearl, whatever happens, whatever comes next, I want you to promise me something." A chill ran down Pearl's spine at his serious tone. "What?" "Promise me you will keep living fully, keep finding joy. Keep being the amazing woman you are. Do not let grief steal the light from you." "Isaiah, do not talk like that. You are going to be fine." "I hope so, but promise me anyway." Pearl pressed her face into his shoulder, fighting back tears. "I promise," she whispered. They sat together until the last light faded from the sky, holding each other close while the world turned around them. Isaiah had another heart episode in the fall. This one was more serious, leaving him bedridden for weeks. Pearl rarely left his side, reading to him, talking about their memories, holding his hand. Thomas and Sarah visited daily with the grandchildren, bringing life and laughter into the sick room. Henry's letters arrived regularly from France, full of carefully cheerful descriptions of army life that did not mention the horrors Pearl knew he must be witnessing. Isaiah rallied somewhat as winter approached. He was able to sit up in bed, to eat more regularly, to stay awake for longer periods. Pearl dared to hope he might recover, that they might have a few more years together. The war ended on November 11, 1918, and the whole nation celebrated. Henry would be coming home. Isaiah smiled when they received the telegram confirming Henry's safe return, scheduled for early December. "I want to be there when he arrives," Isaiah said. "I want to see my boy come home." "You will," Pearl promised. "We will all be there together." Isaiah lived to keep that promise. On December 8, 1918, the whole family gathered at the train station and eager to welcome Henry home. Isaiah insisted on getting dressed in his best suit, though the effort exhausted him. Pearl supported him on one side and Thomas on the other as they waited on the platform. When Henry stepped off the train, still in his uniform, he had changed. The war had marked him in ways that went deeper than the physical, but when he saw his father, his face transformed with joy. He crossed the platform quickly and embraced Isaiah carefully, aware of his fragility. "Welcome home, son," Isaiah said. "I am so proud of you." "I am proud of you too, Pa. For everything you taught me, everything you showed me about being a good man." The family returned to the ranch together, and they had a celebration dinner. Isaiah tired quickly, but insisted on staying at the table, on being part of the joy and laughter. Pearl watched him with her heart in her throat, memorizing every moment. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Isaiah told Pearl he was ready to rest. She helped him to bed and lay down beside him, as they had done for 35 years. "Thank you," Isaiah said softly, "for the most beautiful life a man could ask for being my sunset every single day." Pearl held him close, her tears soaking into his nightshirt. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Thank you for loving me." Isaiah fell asleep in her arms, his breathing growing slower and more labored. Pearl knew what was coming but could not let him go, could not stop holding him even as his chest stopped rising and falling, even as the warmth began to fade from his skin. The doctor said later that Isaiah had died peacefully in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after fighting so hard for so long. But Pearl knew the truth. Isaiah had held on just long enough to see his son come home safe, to have his family together one last time. Then, knowing his work was complete, he had let himself rest. The funeral was held on a cold December day. It seemed like half the state attended, testament to the life Isaiah had lived and the respect he had earned. Pearl stood at the graveside, flanked by her children, and said goodbye to the man who had changed everything for her. In the months that followed, Pearl learned what it meant to grieve. She had promised Isaiah she would keep living, and she honored that promise, but the world felt dimmer without him in it. She found comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the ranch they had built together, in the memories that filled every corner of their home. She also found comfort in unexpected places. Ruth Miller, now elderly herself, came to call one spring afternoon in 1919. "I wanted to tell you how sorry I am about Mr. Miller," Ruth said, sitting stiffly in Pearl's parlor. "He was a good man." "He was the best man," Pearl agreed. Ruth twisted her handkerchief in her lap. "You loved each other very much. It was obvious to everyone. I used to mock that, used to think it was foolish. But now I see how wrong I was. You had something rare and precious, and I wasted my life being bitter about things that did not matter." Pearl looked at this broken old woman and felt the last of her resentment fade away. It is never too late to change, Ruth, to choose kindness over bitterness. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "It feels too late for me." It is not. There is still time to make peace with your choices, to find what joy you can in what remains. Ruth left shortly after, but she returned the following week, and then the week after that. Slowly, cautiously, the two women built something resembling friendship. It was not deep or intimate, but it was real, and it helped Pearl feel less alone. The years passed, marked by the steady rhythms of ranch life and family milestones. Katie grew into a confident young woman with her grandmother's copper hair and her grandfather's kind heart. Marcus became a serious student, showing an aptitude for mathematics that surprised everyone. Thomas and Lucy had a third child, a daughter named Rose. Sarah and Robert added 2 more children to their family, twin girls named Grace and Hope. Henry eventually married in 1922 to a woman named Virginia Foster, no relation to Pearl. She was a widow with a young son, and Henry took to fatherhood with surprising ease. They had children of their own over the next few years, adding to the growing Miller clan. Pearl found purpose in being a grandmother, in passing along the stories of Isaiah and their love to the next generation. She told them about that first meeting in the general store, about the sunset on the ridge, about the way Isaiah had seen beauty where others saw only difference. She lived to see Arizona grow and modernize, to see the automobile replace the horse and buggy, to see electricity come to even remote ranches like theirs. She lived through the ups and downs of cattle prices, through droughts and good years, through all the challenges that ranching life brought. In 1933, on her 71st birthday, Pearl's family threw her a party. 3 generations of Millers gathered to celebrate, from her oldest grandchild Katie, now married with children of her own, to her newest great-grandchild, a baby girl named Pearl in her honor. Standing on her porch surrounded by this vibrant, loving family, Pearl felt Isaiah's presence so strongly it was as if he were standing right beside her. She had kept her promise to him. She had kept living, had kept finding joy, had kept honoring the love they shared by building on the foundation they had created together. That evening, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Pearl climbed the stairs to her room. She was tired, bone-deep tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's activities. She changed into her nightgown and lay down on her bed, the same bed she had shared with Isaiah for so many years. On her nightstand was the photograph taken on their 25th anniversary. Isaiah in his best suit, Pearl in a dress the color of sunset, both of them smiling at the camera with eyes full of love and contentment. She picked it up, tracing Isaiah's face with her fingertip. "I kept my promise," she whispered to the photograph. "I lived fully. I found joy. But I have missed you every single day." Pearl set the photograph back on the nightstand and closed her eyes. She felt peaceful, ready, complete. She had lived a life beyond anything she could have imagined as that frightened girl standing behind the counter at Henderson's store. She had been loved deeply and completely. She had raised good children who were raising good children of their own. She had turned cruelty into compassion, mockery into meaning, isolation into a legacy of love. As she drifted off to sleep, Pearl could have sworn she felt a familiar warmth beside her, like Isaiah's arm coming around her shoulders. She could almost hear his voice, rough and gentle at the same time, telling her one more time that her hair shone like the sunset he loved. She smiled and let herself fall into that warmth, into that voice, into the peace that comes from a life well lived and promises faithfully kept. Pearl Foster Miller died peacefully in her sleep that night, and when her children found her the next morning, they said she looked almost young again, with a smile on her face that suggested she had been reunited with someone she loved dearly. They buried her next to Isaiah on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together. The service was simple, but attended by what seemed like half of Arizona. People came from neighboring ranches and distant towns, old friends and young relatives who knew her only through stories. At the graveside, Thomas stood with his siblings and spoke about their mother. "She taught us that our worth is not determined by what others think of us, but by who we choose to be. She showed us what real love looks like, what real strength is. And she gave us a legacy that will continue for generations." As the service concluded and people began to drift away, a brilliant sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red and gold. Katie, Pearl's oldest grandchild, stood with her own daughter Pearl, watching the colors spread across the horizon. "Great-grandmother used to tell me about how grandfather Isaiah said her hair reminded him of the sunset," Katie said softly. "I never quite understood it until now." Young Pearl, just 10 years old, touched her own copper-red hair self-consciously. She had been teased at school for it, and Katie's heart ached knowing her daughter was experiencing some of what Pearl had endured. "It is beautiful," Katie said firmly, taking her daughter's hand. "Your hair is beautiful, just like great-grandmother's was, and someday, someone special will see that beauty and love you for exactly who you are, just like great-grandfather loved her." "You really think so, Mama?" "I know so, sweetheart, because that is the legacy Pearl and Isaiah left us. Not just a ranch or a name, but the knowledge that true love sees beyond superficial things to the heart of who we are. And that legacy will never die." As the sun sank below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, mother and daughter stood hand in hand on the hillside, connected to a love story that had begun 50 years earlier in a small general store. A love story about a lonely cowboy who saw beauty where others saw only difference, and a woman with copper hair who learned to see herself through his eyes. It was a love story that would echo through the generations, passed down from parent to child, a reminder that kindness and courage and the willingness to look beyond the surface could change not just individual lives, but entire family legacies. And in the end, that was the greatest gift Isaiah Miller had given Pearl Foster. Not just his love, though that was precious beyond measure, but the chance to become who she was always meant to be, strong and confident and beloved. A woman whose hair shone like the sunset, beautiful and unforgettable, lighting up the world around her. The end.